It's Christmas time and I thought I'd make a couple of decorative projects from some pallet wood I've got lying around. Stay tuned as I've got a quick bonus project that's really easy to make, but it'll make life so much simpler when packing all your decorations away after Christmas. What's up woodworkers, Ben here, and this is a big old pile of pallet wood. I've seen loads of people doing these wooden Christmas trees lately, so I thought I'd give it a go. The first thing I needed to do was to plane down the pallet wood to tidy it up a bit, so I ran it through my Titan planer thicknesser. As you can see, it has pretty terrible dust collection, so it made quite the mess. I made sure to mark out the sections of the board that I'll be using and the bits that I'll be cutting off. Areas such as those with knots and nail holes, that kind of thing. Then I cut them to rough length on the mitre saw. I'm going to be cutting some angles on these later, but I just wanted to break them down to a more manageable size first. Next up, I trimmed the edges off them to neaten them up, and you're probably wondering why I didn't do this while the boards were long prior to cutting them up. Well, I'm also thinking the exact same thing right now. Sometimes you just get something in your head and work to that even if it defies all logic. Once I've ripped one edge off, I flipped the boards over and cut the other rough edge off while bringing all the boards to the exact same width. Next up was cutting the angles, and this can be the trickiest part when trying to work out the maths, so to keep it simple I just used 30 degrees on all of my cuts. I decided to do it this way and lay my boards out on their edge rather than flat because I don't really trust the bevel feature on this old mitre saw, and it's a lot harder to dial it in compared to the mitre adjustment, so I just went with that. I've got two different types of cut. The first is the same angle on each end, which I guess makes it a parallelogram. So I cut 4 boards at 150mm like this, and I set up a basic stop block to help me get the exact same measurement. I then cut 4 other boards with opposing angles like this. I cut one at 165mm, one at 145mm, one at 285mm, and one at 100mm. Once I got all my pieces cut, I laid them out just to make sure they would all fit together. You can see how it all fit. Then I had to figure out how to attach them. I figured I'd use glue and brad nails for this one to see how it goes, so I carefully spread some glue on the end of my base piece and then fired a nail into the centre of the board. Once I'd secured it in the centre, I added another couple of nails in nearer the edges. I have to say this was super awkward and not easy to do as the slightest pressure made the pieces want to move, so my advice to anyone wanting to make these and perhaps make more than one with the view to giving them to people or selling them, then I highly recommend making a simple jig with blocks of wood, meaning that you can clamp it in place while gluing it up. If I was batching these out though, I would definitely make one. I figured it would be best to assemble the bottom section and then the top section so I can set the middle pieces at the end. So next up I attached the top 2 pieces together using the glue and brad nail method again, being as careful as I can to make sure I don't fire a nail through one of my fingers. So now I've got the top and bottom sections attached, I needed to attach the middle pieces. After a bit of finagling, I got the right placement and location arranged, and then I added some glue and decided to clamp them in place rather than add more nails, as I thought it'd be a bit too visible in the middle. So while it was in clamps, I measured and marked the centre of the base and the centre of the shortest piece I'd cut so that I could add a healthy layer of glue and clamp it to the base as well. Once the glue had dried, I removed the clamps and added a coat of Danish oil. You might have seen me use this one in other videos. It's called Georgian Oak and it gives a nice classic oak colour, which I really like. And there we go, all finished, and I think it looks pretty good considering it was just tatty old pallet wood. If I was to do this again, I reckon I'd make some form of clamping jig out of some more scrap wood just to make life a little bit simpler when gluing it all up and to make sure that it doesn't shift when I'm firing the nails in. But using 130-degree angle for everything made this a really easy project to do, especially if you've got a mitre saw. Next up, I'm going to make a Christmas Eve box, and we've had boxes like this in the past, but they've all had lids on, which means that you're limited as to what you can put in them. So I thought I'd do my own take on a shipping crate design. I'd already planed down the pallet wood for this one when I did the Christmas tree, so I jumped straight into ripping the boards down to width. I planed all these boards down to 18mm thick and went ahead and ripped a load of boards down that I'll be cutting to length shortly. I ripped them to 45mm wide. While I was at the table saw, I took an old 2x4 that I have lying around and ripped the rounded edges off first, and then I set my fence to 30mm and cut 30mm by 30mm square pieces by keeping the fence set and just turning the board over so that all the sides were exactly the same all the way around. And that's all my pieces ripped to their final width, so I moved on from the table saw and went over to the miter saw. I set up a stop block so I could cut my long front and back pieces first. I make my stop blocks on my miter saw by simply nailing a piece of plywood straight onto my workbench. It might not be pretty, but it works, and it's the easiest way to get a quick stop block set up. I cut 8 pieces in total at this length, as I'll be making my crate 4 slats tall. Now, my base is going to be slats as well, but these slats will run the same length as the front, but they'll bump up to the edges, which means that they need to be the same length as the front minus 2 thicknesses of the slats, if that makes sense. So I just placed 2 slats against my stop block and used that for my measurement. Then when I cut my base slats, I moved on to the end pieces. To do these, I needed to adjust my stop block, so I set it up and cut the rest of the pieces. The last cut was my internal support pieces, so I cut 4 of those evenly as well. Once I had all my pieces, I ran over them all with a sander. A little trick I like to use when sanding multiple pieces of the same size is to clamp them together, as it means I can sand 4 pieces at the same time. Now to the fun bit, watching it all come together. To assemble this box, I first set out the initial layer of the outside edges and placed a couple of my base pieces in to raise my internal support pieces up to where they should be, because they're going to sit on the base. Then I glued and brad nailed these upright support pieces to one of the end slabs. I did exactly the same for the other end, so I had 2 end panels ready. Next up, I wanted to attach the base pieces to the end panels, so I laid them out and used the side pieces as a spacer to separate them all out evenly. I applied some glue to the end of each board and then nailed my side panels in. This was why I designed it with the base sitting inside the crate rather than just nailing it up from the bottom, as the nails will provide a little bit of structural integrity rather than just risking the entire bottom falling off. I attached both end panels and then it was time to move on to the side slats. This was really simple and just a case of adding glue and brad nails using the drill bit as a spacer again, like I did on the end pieces. So now I have a crate and it needs some finishing touches, but I can already tell that I can use this crate design for loads of different applications, and it's so easy to make. I bust out the Georgian oak Danish oil again and rubbed it all over the crate to give it that nice golden hue. I decided I wanted to Christmas this thing up a bit, so I made my own stencil. Now, in hindsight, I should have definitely spent a few quid and bought a stencil or paid someone to make one on a Cricut or something, as this didn't exactly go to plan. I dabbed on the paint fairly carefully, but the stencil didn't come off as neatly as I hoped, and it had bled quite badly on some of the areas. So my method to try and salvage it was to create an outliner with white paint, which worked fairly well in the end. And here it is, the finished box. Now I'm really happy with the way this turned out in general. However, I would definitely get myself a proper stencil for doing the writing next time. So it was a bit of a disaster, to be honest. Now the base is really good as well. That held in with the nails going into the sides rather than underneath, which makes this thing absolutely rock solid. Now why not fill it up this year with things that you want instead of things that you have to get for other people? Now I've got a bunch of discount codes and affiliate links down below for a lot of these items in here. So if you do buy anything on there, thank you very much, as it really helps the channel out. Now I promised you one last thing, so let's check it out. Right, for the last thing, I've got this little scrap of plywood, and what I'm going to do, you can use this with a bit of pallet wood or plywood or whatever you've got lying around. I'm going to make something really easy that you can use to keep your Christmas lights nice and tidy. So I'm going to make this, I might do this a bit fancy, so I'm going to make this 20 centimeters, but you can do this a little bit narrower than that, but I'm going to put a handle on this. So I cut it to length on my miter saw initially, which left me with my basic piece. Now that I've got this, I need to mark out the shape of this piece. Essentially, I marked it out so that it has 2 prongs on each end and a handle at the top. I used my T-square to get all this marked out, and then I used some round items just to draw some curves. Once I had everything marked out, I took my jigsaw and cut round all my lines. Because the handle is inside, I needed to drill some holes big enough to get my jigsaw blade into, then I could just join up the holes to cut it out. Now this is a bit extra, but I decided to round over the edges on the whole thing just to keep everything nice and smooth. I did this on my router table, and it's totally unnecessary really for something like this, but it does feel nicer when you grab hold of it. And I'm a woodworker, and this is exactly the sort of thing we like doing, overcomplicating projects. To wrap the Christmas lights up, I like to start with the plug, so I want to come up with a way to fit the plug neatly into the body of this piece. The best way to mark this out is to simply line up the plug onto the middle and give it a couple of hits with a hammer to mark the location of each pin. These pins are rectangular, and when I've made these things before, I've used a larger drill bit, but I picked up these milling bits recently, so I thought I'd give them a go. So I drilled straight in and then just milled across to the side to elongate the hole to make it big enough for the pins on the plug to fit in. So this is how it looks. I did an old one a couple of years back out of a scrap of pine, as you can see here. It's less refined, and the big difference on the new one is the handle at the top, which makes it so much easier when wrapping and unravelling the cable. The good thing with this is though, that you can use it to wrap extension cords and that kind of thing as well. So I hope you like these projects, and the good thing about all of them is that you can either reuse them year on year, or even look at making a few and selling them. Let me know in the comments how you get on if you do make any of these, and I'll link to some of the tools that I've used in case you wanted to check any of them out. Merry Christmas.